Game design. Because I was such a sweet, good boy growing up, I was far more interested in what an open-world action game would be like in which you played a law enforcement agent rather than a hedonist criminal in the popular all the cool kids have it crime fest of the Grand Theft Auto games. What would it be like to build or maintain social order for the greater good rather than demolish it for funsies and other selfish, sinful material gains? It's not that you can't have games where you build an empire of goodness. I actually have a very functional relationship with one right now, but there's always been something so broadly unattractive about being a cop. Playing a spike strip laying police officer in Need for Speed 3 was never ever as fun as racing through courses in supercars avoiding cop traps. Shaking the cops and losing your wanted level in Grand Theft Auto after a violent rampage is one adrenaline-pumping adventure after another. It's not that we as gamers endorse criminality, it's that criminality is something that can be easily modeled in video games, allowing us to discharge our escapist fantasies in the safe confines of a virtual world. When you're done knocking off that bank, when you're done murdering all those pedestrians, you get to indulge in the fantastical excess of expensive cars, weaponry, and mansions. But what are you going to do as a cop in a video game? Respond to calls? Take victim statements? I was recently treated to look at Grand Theft Auto 5 role-playing servers where players hop in San Andreas cop cars and uniforms and work together to solve crimes, and I can say I was really impressed by the discipline and attention to detail. This video by Trooperkins was fun to watch, and I've put the link in the description below. But in retail game releases, when you've been able to play as a cop in a video game, you're either treated to a Grand Theft Auto clone where you're quote-unquote so far undercover that you have an automatic rationale to do ridiculously illegal things, or any objective sense of justice is set aside for the fiery pursuit of institutionalized vigilanteism where you and your fellow cops take matters into your own hands and fists. There are no supercars to drive home in, no expansive driveways to accept you when you arrive at your suburban split-level home. Just plenty of overtime, rare evenings with the family, and pent-up work-related and post-traumatic stress. And then we get to 2020. Make no mistake, long before the murder of George Floyd and the necessity of Black Lives Matter, decades and centuries before, there's been something fundamentally rotten about the role of police in an America where we let the defeated slavers of the former Confederate States of America build monuments to their never-achieved perverted glory. This video isn't going to detail that, or the Union's uncelebrated share of racism, or the militarization and systemic prejudice of the modern American police force. Instead, we're going to look at what it's like to play a police officer in a video game in a time when even a critically and audience-acclaimed comedy like Brooklyn Nine-Nine is afraid to return to television. To do this, I'm dispatching Beat Cop, a 2017 adventure game by Polish developer Pixel Crow, inspired heavily by irreverent American cop TV shows and movies from the 80s. It's been on my Steam wishlist for a while now, and I figured now is a better time than ever to dive in. Beat Cop opens as Detective Jack Kelly responds to a burglary call at a senator's villa. He takes down the robber, but there's an open safe and missing diamonds. Framed for their theft, Jack is busted down to a street beat in Brooklyn, and that's where you step into his shoes. You have 3 weeks to clear your name, or else. I had 2 separate runs for reasons you'll understand soon enough, so I'm going to spend the first run going over the game's mechanics before we process the game's message in the second. The game is episodic to a fault. Each of Beat Cop's 21 days begin, proceed, and conclude the same way, creating a 20-minute gameplay loop. Longer, fixed gameplay loops like this tend to be more tedious than the famous 30 seconds of fun does, even if replicated ad infinitum. In a big way, it echoes the episodic template of Lucas Pope's Papers, Please, but that game minimizes the framework so you spend more time enjoying the unique opportunities of each day, rather than lingering in the daily standard cruft. But maybe that's Beat Cop's point. Being a cop is supposed to be boring and technical. Each day opens with a briefing down at Precinct 69. Sarge is always fired up and ready to praise or chide you for your previous day's work, then dole out the next day's responsibilities. Your co-workers chop in with their witty remarks, but it ultimately doesn't matter because you don't actually work with them, and their presence doesn't amount to anything more beyond vulgar remarks and witty banter that isn't witty or entertaining at all. In fact, when the briefing is over, you can sit there and engage in more conversation, but it's entirely useless. One last note on this screen. Are you noticing the same thing that I am? Why in the world is this briefing crammed into a tiny side of the screen? I mean, yeah, it's slightly interesting to see that there are different departments within this police station and that things are happening there in them, but they don't actually add anything to the game or anything to what you're doing. So why are they there? In fact, there's at least one character in the briefing room that they don't even show because they can't fit him into this tiny little window. Why is this a tiny little window? Why did they do this? I mean, yeah, your notepad floats in the decorative space so that you can still see the briefing, but it doesn't make sense. So now you're on the block. This is your block. Moving left and right, you've got about a dozen stores, a number of apartment buildings, a church, a dry cleaner, a movie theater, a slice of urban America. You get used to the sights and sounds and the people here. These are your people. But there are factions afoot, and it's where the game gets a little insensitive. Helping or harming each faction moves the meter on your standing with your employer, the police force, but also the Italian mafia and the crew, who are the neighborhood's black criminals. Intending for this to be my first complete run through the game, I initially focused on being the good cop and following the letter of the law, and enforcing the law, and being the law. Laws exist for a reason, If you don't want to get in trouble with the law, don't break it, am I right? If the game is going to let me roleplay a virtual embodiment of the law, let's try that out. That's not to say I wasn't empathetic or compassionate in this first run, but that wasn't my goal quite yet. On your first day, you shadow local legend Fat Mike. He's transferring to another street because you're replacing him. He knows all the locals, and you can tell they've bent his ear. You can also tell he's not entirely on the up and up. He keeps calling you Polly, which is a joke that's never, ever, ever funny. Before long, Fat Mike gets his retirement gift. Before that, though, he shows you the ropes. You see, each day, your job is twofold. 1. Handle the business of the street by writing tickets, towing cars that are parked in the no parking zones, which is often, and 2. Investigating your framing so you can wing your way back into the upper echelon of detective work again. You have 3 weeks to do this specifically because the police captain that'll help clear your name is retiring, so you better have your evidence ready or you'll be stuck on this beat forever. We were just talking about the boring technical details of law enforcement, and your biggest task on this beat is writing tickets. It's a tribute to Papers, Please in a way that's substantially less interesting as far as mechanics go. Most days, Sarge gives you not just a ticket quota, but quotas for specific types of tickets, which break down into 3 categories. Without inspection, you can write up vehicles for no parking zone violations that then have to be towed. Every other infraction requires you to inspect the vehicles. Are the tires worn? That's a ticket, although if you notice a vehicle leaving behind a rubber trail as they park, you can pretty safely assume they have balding or bad tires. Lights? How are the lights? What about the meter? Are they paid up? You're not inspecting for all of these things to start, but they are layered in day by day, again, Papers, Please style. You can spend the time to check each vehicle for every infraction, but there doesn't seem to be any reward for writing tickets that have multiple offenses, and it takes so long to inspect for each aspect that you'll tire of it quickly. Speaking of which, this game likes to talk a lot. Sarge talks, your co-workers talk. When you get dropped off on the block, the driver talks. Then you need to connect with dispatch. Then people run to you with something to say, sometimes when you're in a rush to do something else. Then you're chatting with other people. It doesn't take too many days before you're just trying to hammer your way out of these conversational lockouts, because not only are you unable to access any of your tools or information while you're gabbing on, the writing is pretty terrible. I can understand a tribute to the game's hammy cop idols of the 80s, but this stuff is just bad. Even Kelly is a whiny jerk. I lost empathy for the dude pretty quick. I wish there was a quicker way to get through these dialogue prompts or skip them entirely, because the conversations have built-in beats that you need to wait through before you can hammer through the next prompts. And all of these conversations are riddled with these pauses. Yuck! Each day ticks off in 5-minute increments, although it pauses when you're chatting or doing administrative stuff. The clock doesn't stop when you're writing tickets, giving the vehicle's owner plenty of time to confront you and engage in the game's 3 or 4 "please don't write that ticket" conversations. Most of the time they're willing to bribe you, but sometimes they just need a break. In this run I was merciless, demanding the fee each and every time. It's the law, sir/ma'am. It's understandable that you'll want to front load all of your ticket writing because sometimes you reach the end of the day and everyone's gone home, and what are you gonna do? The game's designers have loaded each day with distractions, whether it's related to your investigation, or a play for or against another faction. You'll find yourself spinning plates dealing with several things concurrently up and down the block. You have a stamina gauge that will deplete through the day, and you'll need to stop for food to replenish it, or you'll greatly reduce your ability to run and accomplish tasks in a timely basis. You'll also find yourself failing to meet deadlines because you're deciding to help the crew, or help an old lady with donuts, or whatever. Unless you're mentally capable of knowing all things at once, you'll often find the optimal route is just to remember it when you start this day, or this entire run, over again. It can be exhilarating to have so much to do at once, but it can also be anxiety amplifying as you're racing from one end to another and you're being held up by a conversation or an animation that needs to take a particular number of frames, or what have you. Sometimes the game is just hammering on that left mouse button because you want the game to get out of its own way so you can enjoy it. Each day has a twist. Early on, you're having to babysit a Russian exchange cop, a drunkard who wanders from store to store that you need to keep tabs on. One day, African royalty is visiting and the whole block becomes a no parking zone, so you need to ticket and tow every vehicle you see. Despite that easy goal, I didn't manage to get all of the illegally parked vehicles towed either time I played this day. There's very little in the way of random crime aside from where you are on the block when the perp flees the scene, but I wager that even that's scripted. Having to catch up to a running criminal and then look down to make sure the handcuffs are ready for me to click on so I can arrest them is stressful, because by the time I look back up, they may have started running in the other direction. It's awkward to operate quickly when the interface is entirely mouse-based. And then you can help the mafia crew factions in their variety of illegal activities. As tedious as the game's bread and butter work is, and it definitely feels like work, there are plenty of bespoke things to do day to day that keep things fresh, at least the first time you play through the game. A lot require you to turn a blind eye to what's going on, whether it's trafficking goods, or extorting stores, or illegally searching vehicles with sliding tile puzzles I was never very good at. You gain or lose favor with the game's various groups by doing this, but I never really understood what it meant. I read afterward that if you max out your rating with either criminal faction, you can get an ending where you join them as an out. These activities tend to benefit each group exclusively at the expense of another, so you're not going to find yourself maxing out your feelings for all the groups simultaneously. You can also curry favor with the people at large, but I'm not quite sure what that amounted to aside from glowing compliments as you walk the beat. By now you've already ingested plenty of the game's pixel art style, and my thoughts are mostly positive. There's an entire debate about how pixel art is an indie game crutch, which is not an argument I'm making today. When this game invests in detail, like in the interface or when you're walking out the block, I think it's charming. I complimented Deus Ex for requiring some manual detective work, and 17 years later, having to use my noggin here is really refreshing. To that end, finding specific buildings or apartments relies on seeking out address numbers in the environment with your own eyes instead of being guided by neon arrows. The game does offer help from time to time when picking out details, but sometimes finding an address relies on some good old-fashioned being attentive. When the game's art direction suffers, it's any time it wants to focus on something. When you enter stores, the game cuts away to a really low resolution internal view, which is basically your conversation box. You don't do anything mechanically in these spaces except chat and sometimes pick dialogue options, so it's not like the internal view needs a higher resolution treatment, but it does look ugly. Even further, your character Jack Kelly is the only character in a cast of dozens that has a full portrait. Everyone else is reduced to a slate of a couple dozen pixels. Between that and the terrible writing, there's very little characterization, which you think a 21 episode game would be perfect at, and it's very difficult to relate to anyone in this game. It sucks. They already put in most of the work. If they just went the rest of the mile, it would have paid dividends. In the end, what doomed me on this first run was that I wasn't good at cop work. I'm not making a moral judgment on what I did, my nose was pretty damn clean. I just couldn't get the mandatory police activities done. The game has 3 obvious financial checkpoints, and that's in your alimony payments to your ex-wife. The first is $300, but then they go up to $600, and you have to pay it or you're booted off the force and it's game over. Playing a by-the-books cop means you're stuck with a police officer's paycheck of $50 a day, but that's only if you pull off Sarge's instructions perfectly, miss a single ticket, or fail to find a specific car, and that gets cut in half. Well, that makes it mathematically impossible to summon the second $600 alimony payment just 10 days in. So I'm going to have to play a little bit differently. Oh, by the way, apparently after I'm fired, I become an activist? Huh. Okay. So let's start our second run. Now you can restart any particular day, but I decided it was for the best that I begin with a clean slate. This time around, I decided I'm going to be on the take. I'll take those bribes, I'll cuddle with those criminal organizations. The field is wide open in my eyes. My greater intent, however, is to empathize with the people on the streets, the people that I serve. Almost 20 years ago, in the real world, I was made moderator at some popular video game forums. I was very diligent about enforcing the rules, even having multiple browser windows open so I could keep tabs on individual forums. I moderated and banned a lot of people. But at a point, one of the older, wiser moderators leaned in and told me to exercise a bit more discretion. If you ban too many of the troublemakers, the forum loses its personality. Yes, people should still be banned for posting porn, but maybe not permanently every time, especially if they're just going to create an alt account that goes undetected for weeks or months anyway. I learned a lot about enforcing the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law through that. If I was ticketing a lady here in Beat Cop who had no money to pay the ticket, then it was also clear that she had no money to replace her balding tires either. I'd let it go. It makes no sense to add to her suffering. Letting her off doesn't score me any in-game people points. It seems to be more for my benefit as the person playing the game. If you're restarting the game at this point and you aren't already irritated with the game's constant dialogue, you will definitely find yourself hammering through it as often as possible here, with whether it's conversations you've already had or new ones you haven't. Yes, I've sometimes missed clues because I'm so frustrated at talking to people in this game. Now, I'm not a prude and I've already mentioned the game's casual vulgarity, but the game's embrace of casual racism is... I don't know. This is the point where I talk about a disclaimer the game presents when you start a new game, explaining the game's influences, but imploring you to just enjoy the game and not take life too seriously, which seems like a limp excuse to not criticize the game's intent and influences. Yes, the game drops racial epithets left and right, but it's designed to be cheap, edgy talk to establish a tone. It's superficial at best. When it comes to actual meaty issues of racism or innocent black people being killed by the police or its systemic racism against people of color, the game has nothing to say. Even though this is a 2017 game that takes place in 1986, it had substantially greater potential to really add weight to every aspect of Beat Cop, even if it became a meaner, nastier game as a result. Then again, considering how paper-thin the characterization is in this game, this probably wouldn't have done particularly well even if the developers' hearts were in the right place. So I turn the other way when the Mafia is doing its nasty stuff. I take $20, $30 bribes in exchange for tossing out parking tickets. The irony is that I still get a bunch of my police objectives completed and I can actually afford to make my alimony payments. I buy drugs from the dealer so I can have the stamina to race up and down the street with ease, and I never get caught, even if Sarge picks me out for taking bribes with little or no penalty. I employ the block sex worker and I actually have no idea what I get out of it, except being able to say I had sex with a sex worker in Beat Cop. I realize that by taking this approach to playing Beat Cop, not only am I replicating Grand Theft Auto's belligerence while wearing a police uniform, I'm actually having fun playing the game, instead of dreading how my letter of the law enforcement isn't paying the bills. There's no joy in wearing the badge in this game and trying to be virtuous when the job is hell, and then life at home is hell as well. It's not hard to see on some very broad scale how this informs police brutality or the contempt that many police officers have for the impoverished or the lesser-to-do that commit crimes, people who typically happen to be of color. This hyper-simplified satire of 80s cop entertainment can still draw out the same broad shapes that explain how police brutality happens in the real world, even if it doesn't really want to get its feet wet about it. I lost the thread on the Senator's Diamonds investigation somewhere around week 2, which meant that after an explosive finale on day 21, my second run ended with me being unable to clear my name and being stuck on the beat forever. Well, not really, because it turns out in an epilogue that Kelly was killed while writing up a ticket. Cool. Awesome. If I'd been able to conjure $2,000, I would have been able to buy a one-way plane ticket to Mexico, which feels like a plausible way out. So is Beat Cop a good game? I mean, it's fine. If you like spinning plate gameplay or just really want something vaguely similar to the day-to-day procedure of Papers, Please, here's your sauce. Is it unfair to judge Beat Cop in the heightened environment regarding police and justice across the country and around the world? I don't think so. This is a rare cop game, so standards are different than a game like Grand Theft Auto that doesn't attempt to have standards whatsoever. There is no standard to criminality. There is a standard to law enforcement and civility. It's inherent. It's why there aren't more cop games. You have to paint players into a corner to be even slightly plausible. Does this mean that a realistic cop game needs to legitimize depraved behavior to become fun? So first off, yes, I did lose the bangs. What am I talking about? The burns. I lost the burns. I lost the Montgomerys. You may be asking about Police Quest or the SWAT games and stuff like that. First off, I was not a Sierra guy. I was drinking soda. I was not a Sierra guy, I was a LucasArts guy, so I didn't have the Police Quest games. And I've played a demo for SWAT 3, so yes, there are definitely cop games I remember when I was looking forward to early on, around 2000, was called Loose Cannon. It was being put together by Digital Anvil, and then it was sold to THQ when Microsoft bought Digital Anvil, and Digital Anvil is Chris Roberts' old company that would go on to do Brute Force, and then Chris Roberts is now doing Star Citizen, which is just a monumental Ponzi scam, whatever the hell it is, but with expensive virtual spaceships. So, whatever. Moving on, of course, I want to thank my patrons over here. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to throw a few dollars at the nth review, hey, links in the description below. I also want to reiterate the 500 subscribers by the 6th anniversary of the nth review. That is October 23rd, 2020. I think we can do that. We're making some good pace. But, let's set realistic expectations. The conversation continues on Discord and Twitter and Facebook and Reddit, but it's also now taking place on Instagram. So that's pretty cool. if you want to see some behind the scenes, I think I'm going to put more behind the scenes stuff on Instagram, which I'm going to clone over to Twitter, because Twitter is a cesspool of nastiness and all kinds of stuff. Gosh, I think that's it. I think it is. So, hey, I'll see you next time.